I am Richard Burrell, author, speaker, adjunct instructor emeritus, about to go into a sound studio in Durham, California, to hopefully create a quality audiobook of Unvanquished, Ishi Story 2023. The narrator's voice is critical, and author's voice lends credibility. This all got started largely because a 37-year-old film producer who wishes to remain anonymous visited me recently in person here in Chico. He bought all of my Ishi trilogy books. I quickly saw in him his great passion for Ishi. And he promised me that his film would be kept factual. He believes hearing my expanded Ishi story will help him finish writing his film script. I know of only 2 other stories as dramatic as the Ishi story, about which I have just released my 8th book. The other 2 are The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank, 1947, while she was kept in hiding in the Netherlands from the Nazis for 2 years, and Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's 2006 released biography titled American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Just arriving in 2023 in theaters is Oppenheimer's film, producer Christopher Nolan's latest thriller. One of my favorite anthropologists in recent history was Thomas Talbot Waterman, born in 1885. He died in 1936. He became obsessed, as I now am, about Ishi, the California Indian. His Yana Indians monograph, published in 1918, was the very first Ishi biography. Canvasser Waterman's standard MO on the UC Berkeley campus to inspire his students to want to also learn more about Ishi was, I often feel that it is hard to tell the story in such a way as to convince people of its reality. My preface for Unvanquished, Ishi Story. In the fall of 1908, some interest was stirred in the newspapers by a story to the effect that hunters with a survey party had encountered in the state of California a tribe of native people who were still in the Stone Age. The idea of a wild tribe in a thickly populated region like California was so novel that it served to awaken an interest that would not fade away. The 3 dark-skinned individuals witnessed, however, had meanwhile vanished. The 2 surveyors, who the day before first encountered a disheveled man, thought he was African. They took him for wild because he was not wearing city clothing, a polite way of saying he was naked. Some 3 years later, an individual who had the appearance of belonging to this group was captured in Northern California. He was put in jail and a few days later turned over by the Butte County sheriff named John Brooks Weber to the University of California. And on September 1st, 1911, Thomas Waterman of the university's Anthropology Department arrived by Western Pacific Overland train and became the first to open communication with the prisoner. On September 4th, 1911, Waterman and an elderly Yana language interpreter named Sam Batwee escorted the Indian in the night by train to San Francisco. That next morning was a beautiful, clear day, the first full day for the people of San Francisco to witness the 2 California Indian visitors, the unnamed wild man of Oroville and Sam Batwee, the civilized interpreter of English and Yana. The former had no name and had been received everywhere as the last survivor of his tribe, an Aboriginal Indian, apparently the last of the Deer Creeks. The 2 stood side by side outdoors in the morning sunshine. They stood in front of a large 3-story yellow stone building with a large basement floor. This building was the University of California Museum of Anthropology, part of the affiliated college's campus. Looking northward, they were afforded a grand view of outer ocean's blue waters that made for a huge natural harbor with green islands. The backdrop was Bay Mountain, Mount Tamalpais, that looms an ancient and sacred site of the Ohlone, California tribe. Thomas Waterman and his colleague and Anthropology Department chair, Alfred L. Kroeber, could barely contain their excitement when they stared at the special dispatch to the Call San Francisco newspaper dated August 31st of 1911 that contained the first published photograph of the mysterious Indian prisoner. The anthropologist quietly hoped that he would be uncorrupted of Western conventions. If he was unspoiled, then they would have a time traveler amongst them, a man whose culture was unchanged since the twilight of the last ice age. Anthropologists and psychologists have predicted that such an individual would see our world differently. He would call attention to what we call the little things, but to him they would be the big things. And just as it would hardly be fish who discovered the existence of water, witnessing what a genuine time traveler thinks and sees would hold a great mirror to our own worldview. Unvanquished Ishi's story goes beyond the barriers of culture. It gives us hope. Told with unvarnished honesty is the remarkable life and tragic death in San Francisco of Ishi, 1911 to 1916. If the reader wants to learn more about true hardships, loss, resilience, and acts of kindness and forgiveness, this is the book for you. Dedication for the caregivers and the lost. Chapter 1, September 4th, 1911, Journey to Outer Ocean. Here we are. The die is cast. 2 California Indians, one called civilized and one called wild, sit on either side of Thomas Waterman, the anthropologist. They are inside one of the Pullman cars of Western Pacific's Overland No. 1 train. The car shifts and rolls as they continue onward towards the tumultuous and progressive city-county of San Francisco on Monday, September 4th, 1911. Thomas Waterman, with the Butte County Sheriff's Office's receipt of release document in his pocket, felt good about what he had accomplished. The return time to San Francisco, 205 miles from Oroville, takes only 7 hours, 20 minutes. Waterman's recent university teachers, Earl Pliny Goddard, Alfred Kroeber, and Franz Boas, had convinced the 26-year-old that all human cultures, be they primitive or civilized, were fundamentally the same in the ways of thinking. Superiority of races is the lie. Cultural relativism is the new understanding to respect. Differences each culture learns are based on their particular history and environment. This newer understanding of respect enables human societies to be kinder, to be more fair, and provide justice for all. This understanding needs only to become more universal. Cannot our species prevent future wars with each other? One asset in San Francisco was that the children wanted to meet a real Indian. This longing had to have been learned starting at a young age from their culture and from their parents. That the West had been won and killed off was part of the cultural myth that continued to circulate. Their race was supposedly vanquished. Primitives, witnessed rarely today, were doomed and were quickly vanishing. These were the hard facts of it all. But the nadir, or lowest population count of California Indians, was in 1906, according to the Kelsey Report, 17,000 survivors, down from an estimated 260,000 in 1849. a 94% decrease in a single century. After 1906, however, Native American populations nationwide began increasing. The latest appraisal has been slow in acceptance, causing more than one tribe to publicly declare, "We are still here." San Francisco newspapers printed that a wild man, an Indian, had been found, exactly the kind of primitive who was in California 100 years ago. The latest news on the wire was that the unnamed is to live in the very middle of San Francisco. The newspapers reinforce that he is the last of his tribe, that he speaks a strange language nobody can understand. This least civilized man tells his tale by signs. The news headlines report. More announcements followed. Beginning on Sundays in October, the public is invited to the new Museum of Anthropology up on Parnassus. There was no mention of any living exhibits, but there were many who genuinely hoped that the mysterious past of Mr. Ishi would soon be revealed. It might have been that Sam Batwey sat farthest from the Indian stranger across the aisle, as they did not get along. But Batwey surely kept within hearing distance to continue his interpreting, for which he was being paid. Normally, sharing a mutual language, which in this case was Central Yana, required getting close with the other. They could share deep feelings and better understand each other's point of view. If only the two cooperated, Waterman probably wished. The wild one is readier to make friends with me than with the other Yana speaker. Batwey had let his facial hair grow into a beard. He also wore spectacles and white man's clothes. The other had singed his long black hair with a red coal for apparently someone in mourning. He also pulled whiskers from his chin one by one. He would not wear shoes, but carried them instead. That same day in Oroville's Butte County jail, Batwey had learned that he does not speak pure Yana, but has a kind of mixture between Central Yana and Mexican. This Waterman made a note about to tell his superior, Professor Alfred L. Kroeber. Waterman wondered how different is the Deer Creek language from the Central Yana dialect. Batwey had also interpreted from the Yana Yahi that he had a wife, but she is dead now, and he is all that is left. The editor for the more conservative Oroville Mercury titled this essay, "Queer Indian Talks with Educated One," 1911, September 4th, page 1. Was this the correct translation? Or did the wild one mean to be understood that his female partner had escaped, and it was their child who had died? Waterman's doubt stemmed from having read one of the Oroville Daily Register papers by editor George Mansfield, who had been with the Indian every day since he was found. Also, a Bidwell Indian from Chico, a medicine man named Bill Conway, also heard that their papoose had died, and his female partner was still in the mountains. Keeping the peace between them was critical. Waterman would use a different tact. No personal family questions, or he may get defensive and evade questions. During the train trip, as long as there was willingness, they could keep compiling a list of the Deer Creek Southern Yana nouns. The backside of the receipt of release document with Waterman's vocabulary notes shows that there was cooperation. To have secured these particular nouns, it is surmised that Waterman very well could have taken out his large volume photographs of baskets. One photo, too, of an Indian in traditional dress he may have used as still another prompt. Conceivably, one basket photo was of the coiled tray basket that Waterman had uncovered when at Grizzly Bear's hiding place in 1909. About this flat basket, Waterman had studied its fibers with a glass. Why, it still has a white acorn paste adhered to it, he proudly proclaimed. Here is clear evidence that the Deer Creeks still are following this method of obtaining their daily bread. Now, right next to him sat one of the Deer Creeks he had been searching for since 1908. When the Indian stranger grew fatigued, Waterman learned one more word, and all translation work stopped. This last word was likely the adjective kawi, tired. Western Pacific Overland Train Number 1 rolled onward through the afternoon and into the dark of night. Ishi was a momentary visitor at these city depots en route to San Francisco, namely Marysville, Pleasant Grove, Sacramento, Stockton, Lathrop, and Tesla. The train wove westerly and up the Coast Range hills to Altamont, down its western slope to Livermore, and past Pleasanton. Quick look! Hacienda del Pozo de Verona. Now she wound through Niles Canyon to Niles. Our train went northwesterly to Hayward, San Leandro, arriving at the Oakland Mole at 9:25 p.m. At 9:32 p.m., Iron Monster's 460 wheels slowed to the end of the track and stopped. Everyone stepped down and inside the huge wooden shed that smelled much of oily smoke. The two Indians were briskly ushered forward by the ever-eager Thomas Waterman, beckoning them onto a large watercraft just outside the shed. Mounted in the vessel's middle was a big black fire chimney. A steady running and shuddering sound was heard and felt, coming from somewhere inside this boat. The craft they were on felt alive. Suddenly, a loud horn blasted forth. The craft upon which they stood began moving out in the dark waters. The air possessed a salty smell. And there blew upon them gusts of soft wind. Ishi, yet unnamed, and Sam Batwey first saw the ferry building looming closer and closer to them as they crossed the bay on the ferry boat from Oakland to San Francisco. The ferry building was built in 1898. Its 235-foot tower survived the great earthquake and fire of April 1906, and also the Loma Prieta earthquake on October 17, 1989. In the 1906 event, at 5:16 a.m., the ferry building's clock stopped. In the 1989 event, the ferry building clock stopped at 5:04 p.m. Upon exiting the Oakland Mole Depot Monday night, San Francisco Examiner reporter Philip H. Kinsley observed that when Ishi stepped into the ferry boat, he was frightened again, walking gingerly as though he thought the floor would not hold him. When the whistle blew, he trembled and grew rigid and displaying the same fear again that the baby shows. In front of them, there shone yellowish lights. They may have watched as another fireboat passed by, churning its way back from where they had come. Both watercrafts sent up black, billowing smoke. Now, as they approached closer to the brightly lit village, the towering ferry building loomed before them. Its stone tower may have reminded Ishi of one of the people's lookout towers along Deer Creek Canyon. The fireboat slowed down. Ropes were tied onto the dock's moorings by shadowy figures. Together, the threesome walked up the wooded gangplank. The ever-observant Waterman glanced up at the clock position, showing 10 p.m. This the 4th day of September, 1911, according to the Galtu calendar. Inside Tall Finger House, they walked on a sleek floor and polished stone. The last leg of their journey was a blur of bright lights, the sounds of motor car engines, and blaring automobile horns. Felt inside the undefined conveyances that they rode in was swaying and bouncing. The last thing about the journey Ishi invariably would have recalled for he had outstanding recall, was meeting Machapa, the chief, Alfred Kroeber, inside the Big House Museum. Kroeber detailed his first meeting with the unnamed in Batwe in his formal speech that he gave publicly that next day. They had arrived. Kroeber was present and surely joyful that they appeared to be safe. There was no need for any introductions, and it was late. Kroeber asked the guests one question. "Would you like dasi, salmon, for supper?" Comprehending, Batwe said to Kroeber in his Central Yana language, "Hana, yes." Batwe then turned to his brethren and asked, "Joke guy Lopa, would you like salmon for supper?" "Hana," he replied, with his eyes lit up. They both would like salmon. After this repast, the two were led upstairs and to the back to a dry and safe room where they retired for rest and hopefully some much-needed sleep. Chapter 2, Standing on Parnassus. Ishi had a new home for a time on Parnassus Avenue. He had arrived. Now he, too, was a modern man, a city dweller, with a street address. Theodore Kroeber, 1961, page 120. 1911, Tuesday morning, September 5th. The first full day. The time traveler Ishi awoke inside a strange room with familiar Sam Batwe probably lying in a second bed or cot nearby. A knocking noise on the door came from Thomas Waterman. It was the start of Ishi and Batwe's first day in the great village. That morning was a beautiful, clear day, the first full day for the people and the newspaper reporters of San Francisco to witness the unnamed Indian, who was being called the last survivor of the Deer Creeks, the last of his tribe. What was this man's past? That was everyone's foremost question. What will be his future? That was only some people's concern. The two standing side by side outdoors in that morning sunshine became an iconic moment. They stood in front of the large 3-story Yellowstone Anthropology Museum building with large basement floor in the very center of the city county of San Francisco, in the Parnassus Heights district on Parnassus Avenue. The museum building was one of 3 called the Affiliated Colleges campus, all part of the University of California, established in 1868, with its main campus located across the bay in Berkeley. The museum's premier opening to the public was scheduled in early October, less than 2 months out. Looking northward, the 2 California Indians were afforded a grand view of one of outer ocean's blue waters extending arms that makes for one of the largest natural harbors in the world. 2 islands, one smaller and gray, the other larger and green, were in view. The backdrop in the north direction is Mount Tamalpais, sacred to the Ohlone people, who are still here today. During that morning and into the midday, San Francisco's press corps met face-to-face with a still nameless and mysterious Indian brought to the affiliated colleges campuses from Oroville. The press would be updated about the so-called Deer Creek Indian situation and future plans by Professor Alfred Kroeber. Thomas Waterman was available for questions from the press as well. The unnamed would receive 2 gifts, a pocket knife from a kind man named Davis, and a white bone whistle from a marry-me woman reporter named Miller. Ishi's newly assigned corner room was on the 2nd floor and at the back or south side of the big house. The Indian guest knew absolutely no English language words. What a museum is and contains would be introduced today and tomorrow. In less than 1 week from today, Ishi would refer fondly to his corner room, where he worked and stayed overnight, as his wowie, which in Yahi means house or home. Here is what Ishi soon learned about his corner room inside the Big House Museum. The Big House's back side that faced the south direction abutted along the very base of a rounded mountain, Mount Sutro. That was a natural wonder of forest of mostly spicy-smelling Tasmanian eucalyptus trees. During Ishi's time in San Francisco, Sutro Forest was a healthy forest with well-maintained trails that led hikers to a vista, making for an island at the very center of the metropolis. The local neighborhood children especially considered Sutro Forest their enchanted home for play and exploration. To the west direction of the Big House Museum is the city's Sunset District. On September 5th, 1911, newly arrived Ishi waved a hand towards the ocean while talking Yahi. Batwi translated his words. "Much to see. Big water off there. Plenty houses, many things to see." Miller, 1911. The reporters quote, "In 1911, there were only 2 blocks of wowie houses, then countless sand dunes with yellow and green ice plant flowers that extended all the way to Pacific Ocean. The Kaltu's name for outer ocean, with its fresh salt air. On summer day mornings, Ishi would experience balls of rolling white clouds that he called pog, that blocked tuna, the sun, and lowered temperatures, but by midday, tuna pushed back through and the temperature rose." To the north direction of the Big House Museum, the front door afforded a scenic view of the inner bay. Moving trolley cars with bells also park near the front door, but also go to other locations by following rails or tracks. Here Ishi had access to a third natural wonder called Golden Gate Park, rich with numerous paths, lakes, flowers, familiar California quail and woodpeckers, lots of squirrels and curious creatures called bison. All of this was just 3 blocks distant on foot below and down the hill. In the east direction, and right next door, stood the second big house called UC Hospital. Beyond it was third big house called Pharmacy and Dental Colleges. Walking farther east on Penarsis Avenue came to Stanyan Street. Ishi learned that the Waterman wowie was on Stanyan Street, but this was short-lived. The rest of east direction for Ishi was Hansi Galtu wowie, many people's houses, as well as stores, the financial center and its banks, and small factories. Lastly were the long piers with boats and ships docked. Ishi surely heard that Market Street was called the Slot, a kind of canyon, if you will, that runs to and from Tall Finger House. Thomas Waterman led Ishi and Batwi downstairs and out the museum's large front door to rendezvous with Alfred L. Kroeber. Kroeber conferred with Waterman about the morning plans. The city's press corps and photographers were invited. The unnamed would be introduced by Professor Kroeber, and a photo session would be afforded the press. The 2 California Indians were both Yana. They stood together side by side in front of the University of California's affiliated college's campus and looked afar at the grand view of the bay's blue waters. The unnamed asked Batwi, hoping he could tell him the direction where they had crossed the Daha, Big Water, the Sacramento River, during yesterday's journey. Waterman saw how disheveled, compared to Batwi, the unnamed looked. Not knowing any differently, he had slept last night in bed while wearing his new city or civilian clothes. Clearly discernible to Waterman were new creases on the arms of his dress coat. His brown silk tie that was fastened to his shirt was also wrinkled. Professor Kroeber took the historic photo of the two. A German-American friend and photo portraiture and essayist, Louis Stellman, waved his hello. The newspaper reporters were fast arriving. They had more questions. What is his name? How old is he? Who is he? Why is he called by some a Deer Creek Indian? A minority among them wanted to know what will be his future. Ishi meets reporter Mary Ash Miller. When the San Francisco Call reporter named Mary Ash Miller signaled Batwey with her hand, Batwey stepped over to her, and Ishi followed. Others clustered around, forming a fairly close circle, including another reporter named Philip Kinsley, who would publish Untainted Life Revealed by Aborigine, 1911, September 6th, San Francisco Examiner. Batwey turned to Mary Ash Miller and volunteered his own thoughts about the one we call Ishi today. Batwey said, "First, yesterday, he frightened very much. Now, today, he think all very funny. He liked this place here. Much to see. Big water off there." Batwey's introduction of Ishi to Mary Ash Miller was encouraging for her. For the entire week, she would produce outstanding pieces of journalism about Ishi that has had lasting value. Philip Kinsley wrote that Ishi was being reserved around reporter Miller. He added, "He hardly dared look at her." This was a correct depiction based on having respect. Visiting Yahi men in social settings customarily speak directly only to other men when the wife is also present. But this was not the situation on hand. Rather, this was the very first Galtu, marry me, white woman, that Ishi was encountering. At this same moment, Kinsley observed the fact that she had a Votes for Women button on, and he saw that it was bright and colored and laughed, but he was clearly afraid of her. Reporter Philip Kinsley, 1911, did not write that Miller gave her Votes for Women button to Ishi, which is what The Last of His Tribe, home box office film 2004, starring John Voight and Graham Greene, would have the viewers believe. The desire by Ishi to collect and adorn on his clothes such medicine that influenced the behavior of others was likely affirmed and adopted at that place and time by Ishi. In native cultures, persons who adorn themselves with bright, shiny shields of various sizes are what doctors or shamans wear to catch and redirect good or bad medicine. Ishi at first may have wondered whether the Marry Me might be a shaman doctor in disguise. Indeed, Ishi was already a practicing Kui, medicine man, himself, which would be acknowledged by many in the weeks and months to follow. The hour arrived for introducing the unnamed to San Franciscans. Alfred Kroeber had a commanding presence. Every chair for sitting and listening outdoors was taken. There was standing room only for the others. Everyone hushed and listened intently to Kroeber's speech. The one we know as Ishi observed this. Ishi sensed that the slender man with mustache and beard, and who had served he and Batwey's salmon last night, possessed headman qualities. Ishi could not understand most of Mechupta Kroeber's speech. Batwey listened to the speech in English and kept silent throughout. While Kroeber spoke, Ishi's inward thoughts may have shifted to the fact that every village of people has a headman as well as a Watu Risi, one with the least honor, he who sits at the foot of the ladder and closest to the lodge door. Ishi may have wondered where he would fit among this ranking in the new village wherein he now found himself. Ishi did not shrink from ranking. Two subtle distinctions that Ishi demonstrated early on and provided exclusively for Kroeber and for Waterman was he never used their personal names when speaking directly to each of them. For both when addressing them, Ishi said you, English, or Ainuma, you, the formal address in Yana. For everyone else, Ishi quickly adopted the white man's habit of calling people freely by their names. That's Theodore Kroeber, 1961, page 151. One funny episode about ranking that occurred was this. Someone, maybe a reporter or Waterman, pointed to Kroeber. Ishi, seeing this, said out loud, "Big Cheap." For Ishi, as with other cultures in the world, it is impossible to pronounce the sound of the letter F. Instead, the sound of P is heard. Saying "Big Cheap" brought laughter to everyone, except for Ishi, who could not understand exactly why the laughter occurred. As an aside, we recall that fog by Ishi was pog. Kroeber's September 5, 1911 speech. Before day's end, A.L. Kroeber was quoted in the San Francisco Chronicle article, "Lone Survivor of Southern Yahi Strange Man," 1911, September 6th, with these profound observations. "He is more aboriginal than any of the Indians we have studied in 10 years. He wears buckskin thongs placed through holes in his ears and another through the septum of his nose. Formerly, he had an abalone shell attached to those thongs. Without such adornment, he does not believe he can enter his heaven. Just what his conception of that place is, we have not yet learned. We have learned some of the traditions and stories of his tribe. The theory of fire is one he has partially explained. He tells of a sort of god known as Coyote, who stole the fire from somewhere and brought it to his tribesmen, who have kept it since. This man's people formerly roamed near Mill Creek and Deer Creek in Tehama County. It is a question whether there is any one of his tribe except himself living. It is against his religion, whatever it is, to talk of his dead. It is sacrilege for him to tell of any of his dead tribesmen or women. We know the form of mourning, however, used by these Indians. They singe their hair short by using coals to indicate that their family is dead. Ishi here had singed his hair short. His method of shaving is to pluck the whiskers from the face as they appear. One of the characteristics of this man is his long chin, unusual with the Indians, but not unknown. His gestures are similar to those of the civilized Indians. It was with difficulty we secured him for study. Charles E. Kelsey of San Jose, an Indian agent in charge of this district, wired his permission to the sheriff of Oroville for us to get the man and bring him here. We are under orders to protect him from sideshow agents and museum men, some of whom have already attempted to get him. If the land of Deer Creek, which Ishi's tribe used, has not been taken up, it is possible that the president may be induced to issue a proclamation giving a tract to him for his use, thereby ensuring him a living. Ishi seems to be willing to eat anything we give him for food. He has confidence in us and eats it all. We showed him how to eat stewed fruit using a spoon, and he readily took to that method, even carrying it so far that he tried to eat a whole raw peach with a spoon. He is a wonderful observer. When Professor Waterman pointed to the edge of the cot upon which he sat in Oroville and said iwi, the Indian word for it, Ishi indicated in his language that Professor Waterman was wrong, that the object was sugar pine, and so it was. Some of the first words secured from Ishi are throat, tolati, ear, manku, teeth, kitawana, hair, iota, hand, tala, feet, lola, white man, galtu, sun, tuna, woman, marry me. The plural is indicated usually with the suffix we, foot being lola and 2 feet being loiwi. White man is galtu, while 2 white men being galtuwi. Kroeber concluded, so far has the Deer Creek's education progressed, and that their guest will be kept at the affiliated colleges for as long as possible so that his language and the customs of his tribe can be studied, after which provision will be made for him by the Indian agent. The first time Ishi refused a request. But shyness had its limits, for soon the one we have come to know as Ishi refused for his first time to obey orders. Waterman had directed Batwe to tell Ishi that more photographs of him were going to be taken by the reporters present. Moreover, Waterman wanted him to put on this garment of skins that Waterman held up for him to see. Perhaps the anthropologist wanted to help the press to capture for San Franciscans the depth of the Indians' aboriginal ways. But now, some of the prior psychological injury done to Ishi surfaced. When asked by Waterman to dress for his aboriginal part, he refused. Instead, he turned and spoke sternly in Yana to Batwe. Batwe listened and then looked up at Waterman and Kroeber. He say he not see any other people go without them, and he say he never take them off no more. A review of just some of the earlier events that is centered around Yahi-Yana fur robes is warranted. It may help explain Ishi's anger that exploded inside him that decided for him enough. The garment to be put on was already intimately familiar to Ishi and to Waterman. It was one of at least 3 fur robes or cape blankets made of animal pelts, hand-stitched together, that had been stolen from the Deer Creek's camp, discovered by surveyors in November 1908. The newly hired anthropologist, Thomas Waterman, fully accepted his chairman Alfred Kroeber's motivational charge that made right after the discovery in 1908 of wild Indians found on Deer Creek and disappeared. To the field then, find and rescue them, record and publish about the Deer Creek tribes, language, and their history. This became Waterman's initial career walk. Oozing with confidence, his shout became, "If I don't do it, nobody else will." Beginning in 1909 through 1911, and with Kroeber's full support, Waterman carried out secret forays into the remote Tehama County foothill wilderness some 180 miles northwest of San Francisco. On every trip, he learned new things. In 1909, he became hell-bent on 2 families, the Apperson and Polk families, who bragged about their Indian goods plundered from the Deer Creek Indians' last camp that the surveyors had found. Thomas Waterman located and hounded 2 parties who each kept a big stash or collection of Deer Creek Indian relics. Namely, 1. The Jack Apperson collection was guarded in his home in Vina, 18 miles north of Chico, by recruiting and befriending Jack Apperson's youngest of 2 sons, Merle Apperson, and his initial guide to search for the Deer Creek remnant tribe in hiding. Waterman was led to the encampment and photographed its 3 house structures. By 1910, Waterman finally observed the entire Apperson treasure trove and with permission took photographs. Over time, Waterman provided Kroeber with his recommended list for university appropriations, numbered K1 through K22. The K standing for Kroeber. Listed as the top 3 to obtain were K1, deer head decoy. K2, fur robe of wild cat and raccoon skins. And K3, the huge quiver of otter skin. It would be on about May 14, 1914, when the University of California obtained K1 through 22 for an undisclosed amount in dollars. 2. The Polk family collection became part of the Polk/J. McCord Stilson collection kept in Chico. Waterman interviewed Butte County surveyor Martin C. Polk as early as 1909. On September 3, 1911, Martin Polk had flaunted some of the Indian relics taken from the camp, discovered in 1908, in front of Ishi when he was being kept in the Butte County Jail in Oroville under protective custody. Editor George Mansfield of the Oroville Daily Register wrote about that visit that the Indian instantly seized them and was transported with happiness. Ishi clearly recognized that the relics were from his people. Ishi surely felt teased. Feeling anger for yet a second time led him to saying no on September 5, 1911 in San Francisco, when Waterman brought out the same fur robe he apparently kept in a secret storage locker in the museum in San Francisco. He was asked to put the same fur robe on for the photo session. Waterman had apparently finagled a temporary loan agreement with the Polk family, too. Today, this fur robe is part of the California State Indian Museum collection in Sacramento. Ishi finally gave in to Waterman's request. Ishi stood his ground for a time with no, he would not take off his overalls no more. Waterman finally said to Batwee, "Tell him, Galtu, just plain." Batwee repeated this, and this explanation seemed to reassure him. The compromise agreed to was that he would put on the familiar fur robe and that the white man's overalls would be rolled up above his knees and the fur robe draped over to cover the rest. Desired by the press corps was a more natural backdrop, so he was led to the back and to the west end of the museum building to a spot below the start of Sutro Forest, where the entourage followed and got the photos taken. Ishi had already had his picture taken by the Galtu white man for all 8 days in Oroville, but a battery of half a dozen cameras focused upon him made Ishi nervous. Reporter Mary Ash Miller wrote, "He stood with his head back and a half smile on his face, but his compressed lips and dilated nostrils showed that he was far from happy." Reporter Mary Ash Miller recalled what transpired next. Once the cameramen left, Ishi assumed his customary posture of sitting on his haunches there in the sand. Waterman hurriedly retrieved from the museum a traditional fire stick and hearth board, which Ishi recognized, and at last delight shone again in his eyes. Fire kits in Northern California are very similar. Waterman never revealed from where or from whom he procured it. Miller writes, twirling the fire stick spindle vertically against the baseboard flat, he made smoke. But he stopped and spoke to Batwee. Batwee announced, "He says it's no good. It wrong kind of iwi wood." This may have been another protest from Ishi. We may never know. Mary Ash Miller then convinced the Indian to show him hunting techniques, which Ishi obliged her. Ishi's eyes fell on net ropes he had brought with him from Oroville. These were made of inner bark and deer hide. Immediately, he became animated and gave a graphic portrayal of the capture of a deer. He laid the nets along the ground, pantomimed how the antlered stag walked into them, and how the animal made its death struggles. Next, he folded a leaf between his lips and sucked on it so strongly that a wailing sound closely resembling the bleating of a fawn was heard. This was an illustration of his mode of deer hunting. He then hid himself and bleated, calling deer to come, wrote Mary Ash Miller in her call, the article published the next day. He was like a child showing off yesterday. Smiling delightedly, he showed how, after he had called the deer, he drew back his bow to the farthest limit and let the arrow fly. Then he galloped away with his hands, indicating that the deer had escaped, making tracks in the sand with his 2 fingers. Then he bleated again and showed another deer approaching from the other side. Again he drew his bow, and that time the deer was his. Rabbits he hunted with a queer sound, resembling more the popping of gigantic corks than anything else. Queer marks were made in the sand, and strange gestures, all of which indicated rabbits. Bear he described by growls, more tracks in the sand, and finally by raising his arms high and lowering his head, bringing to mind by his mimicry the terrible truths of the bear. He did not shoot the bear, but ran away and climbed a tree. Salmon fishing he illustrates, too, with prayers and the tossing of roots into the stream. First and last impressions observed of Ishi on September 5, 1911, his first full day in San Francisco, were eloquently written by reporter Mary Ash Miller. Her gift-giving of her white bone whistle to Ishi was now set in the remembered memory of Ishi. She began by saying, "It is difficult to realize that he is absolutely aboriginal, yet seeing must be believing. He is without trace or hint of civilization, but he is learning fast and seems to enjoy the process." Mary Ash Miller, 1911, September 6, Indian Enigma is study for scientists. Tribes remnant awed by white man's life. The San Francisco Call, page 1. Mary Ash Miller concluded about him, "If he may be considered as a sample, man has not been invariably improved by the march of time. The Indian is wonderfully quick and intelligent. He has a delightful sense of humor. He is docile, cheerful, and amiable, friendly, courageous, self-controlled, and reserved, and a great number of other things that make him a very likable sort of person. Waterman says that he has learned to sincerely admire and like the old fellow during their intercourse. And although he is about 60 or 65 years old, he doesn't look it by 15 or 20 years. In appearance, he is far superior to the average California Indian. He is nearly 6 feet tall, well-muscled and not thin. His face is rather the pointed type, with a long chin and upper lip and a straight nose. His eyes are large, very black, of course, and exceedingly bright and wide awake. His eyelashes are the variety that bring to mind the idea that he bought them by the yard and was rather extravagant about it. His thick hair is jet black and short, he having burned it off after the death of his family. His hands are long and narrow, with very long fingers. The palms show that he has never done manual labor of any kind, as they are as soft as a woman's. The inner cartilage of his nose are pierced, and this, Sambatwi explains, is what he'd believe. It is medicine or religious faith that by this means he is saved from going to bad place and will certainly go good place after death. Little knotted strings, apparently sinews of animal, are in the holes, which are of considerable size. His ears and the inner cartilage of his nose are pierced, and this, Sambatwi explains, is what he believe. It is medicine or religious faith that by this means he is saved from going to bad place and will certainly go good place after death. Little knotted strings, apparently sinews of animal, are in the holes, which are of considerable size. This researcher makes a stand here. According to Dr. Saxton T. Pope, 1920, page 184, actually Ishi was a man of medium stature, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, and weighing about 165 pounds. A note about this chapter: not included are Mary Ash Miller's next 9 paragraphs, but herein inclusive of the rest. He talked to Batwe freely, but would tell little that was personal. His name, if he knows it, he keeps to himself. It is considered bad form among Aboriginal tribes, I am told, to ask anyone's name, and it is seldom divulged until a firm basis of friendship is established. The unknown, however, declared he had no name. In reply to Batwe's questions, he shows by a wandering forefinger that he had been all alone. There was no one, he says, to tell him his name, and he has none. He is so desirous of doing as the Romans do, since he arrived in civilization, that it was thought he might be induced to tell his name when he knew that all white men had them. Batwe told him it was customary in the best circles, or words to that effect, and in response, he declared his entire willingness to have a name. He had none, he reiterated, but if anyone has one to give him, he would gladly receive it. Batwe calls him John, but Dr. Kroeber declared that lacking in individuality. "We must have a name for him, though," said Waterman. "We can't go on calling him, 'Hey there.' For the present, his christening will be deferred in the hope that some name may develop later." All questions as to his wife he evades. He has a word, Maela, which was at first mistaken for Mahela, which the Indians use for wife. But that is not the meaning, Waterman says. When he is asked anything about his wife, he begins to tell Indian myths or legends. How the coyotes stole the fire, bits of stories of women's work, imitations of a woman cooking mush with bubbling sounds of boiling. This is perhaps because Aboriginal tribes will never speak of the dead. Waterman said yesterday, "It's as though you asked a man when he got his divorce and he began to tell you the story of Cinderella." He will eat anything that is given him without much apparent preference. Sweets, however, he seems fond of, and doughnuts delight him. He knew nothing, of course, of eating with knives or forks, but he was taught in the Oroville jail to eat with a spoon. This habit he had adopted, and when given a peach, proceeded to eat it with his spoon. He has likewise learned to smoke cigarettes, and already his fingers are badly stained. When he was given chewing tobacco, he ate it. Batwe demonstrated with him and asked if it did not make him sick. This the unknown denied and said that it made him strong, did him good. When he was wandering, he used some kind of Indian wild tobacco, but his first taste of plug cut, or its equivalent, he received from the jailer in Oroville. He told Batwe that this man, big man, all the same as Chief, had given him tobacco and also to the blue shirt and overalls which he was wearing. Charles L. Davis of Washington, D.C., who is an Indian inspector, happened to be in San Francisco and went out to see the Indian yesterday. In parting, he presented the unknown with his knife, saying that he wanted him to remember him in case they ever met again. The Indian accepted it and seemed to know its use, opening the blades and finally putting it in his pocket. His newly acquired pockets, by the way, are as keen a delight to him as are those of a small boy, and he has a great collection of odds and ends in them already. I, Mary Ash Miller, thought I would give him a present too, but found I had nothing either amusing or instructive with me save a white bone police whistle. This I blew for him, which seemed to please him greatly. Then I gave it to him. He tried to blow it, but was afraid to put it between his lips at first. When he understood the method of manipulating it and found
he must blow it hard. He blew a mighty blast. Nothing that he has had since he left the wilds has pleased him more, Waterman said. He would blow with all his might and then laugh heartily. Finally, he fairly got the giggles, laughing out loud. Dr. Krober was away when he first whistled, and when the former returned, the Indian became suddenly shy and wouldn't blow. At the noon hour, a siren whistle someplace across the city sounded. He looked at me and smiled, and I nodded at the whistle in his hand. He laughed again, and with a sly look at Dr. Krober, blew with all his might and main. All of this sounds as though the absolutely primitive state of the man's mind and life might be exaggerated. No one who sees him can doubt the statement of the anthropologist that he is the find of a lifetime on account of his lack of up-to-dateness.
Here, the print of the article by call reporter Mary Ash Miller becomes broken and illegible. Salvaged are two last observations by Miller. If he wants to, he will be permitted to return to the mountains. But it seems probable that all the well-cooked food he wants will take the keen edge off the enjoyment of thoroughly primitive conditions. Upon having met with the Indian at the affiliated colleges on September 5, 1911, the following is Charles L. Davis's letter that he sent on the same day to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Mr. E.B. Merritt, in Washington, D.C. The letter is preserved in the National Archives and Letters Administration of the United States. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Washington, D.C. Sir, for several days past, the public press of this state have contained news items of the capture of a lone wild Indian of unknown tribe near Oroville, California. The papers this morning, September the 5th, reported that this Indian had been brought to this city by one of the faculty of the University of California. So I went out to see him and investigate as to the truth of the reports. I found him at the affiliated colleges of the university, in charge of Mr. T.T. Waterman, one of the instructors in the Department of Anthropology. Mr. Waterman was very courteous in offering me every opportunity to see and confer with the Indian, and was desirous of getting in touch with the Indian Bureau relative to the care of the Indian. Except for the over-coloring usual with newspaper reports, I see nothing materially incorrect in the reports. I talked with Mr. Waterman and Sam Batwey, the interpreter, and carefully observed the Indian. From the best I could gather, he was captured some 10 days ago by an officer about 3 miles east of Oroville, in the vicinity of a slaughterhouse. His only apparel at the time being a tunic of canvas he had made from some old tent or wagon cover he had found or pilfered from some of the nearby ranches. He bore no arms, and so far as I learned, made no resistance. He was taken to the Oroville jail and held there for about a week, during which time he was visited by many whites and Indians who went through curiosity and to try to communicate with him. All attempts to communicate failed until arrival of Mr. Waterman. He finally was able to ascertain that the Indian understood some of the Yana words, but could not converse with him. Mr. Waterman, after receiving a message of approval from Special Agent Kelsey, whom he knew, obtained permission from the local officers to bring him here and wired for Sam Batwey to come to him. This Sam Batwey of Reading was known to the university as a Yana who had formerly aided in recording their language. Batwey is an Alati and within the jurisdiction of Superintendent H.G. Wilson of Roseburg. He is about 65 years old, fairly intelligent, and seemingly trustworthy. He speaks the English fairly well and has retained his own language, which is known to the scientists as the Northern Yana. Batwey says his own tribe of band is now reduced to 11 or 12 full-bloods and some few mixed bloods, and that the language used by them is quite different to that of the other Indians of his part of the state. So far, the Yana Indian gives no name for himself, explaining that he has none. This Indian is seemingly quite intelligent, about 50 to 60 years old, in good health, but rather emaciated from want of proper food, and withal quite cheerful. At first he was quite in terror of everyone, Indians quite as much as whites, and while the terror is in evidence as he is subjected to the new experiences, on the whole he is rather at ease and fast gaining in confidence. There are no criminal charges of any kind lodged against him when put under arrest and confinement, though it is alleged that the band of which he is supposed to be was the sole survivor has long annoyed the community in the vicinity of their haunts by robbing camps and isolated cabins of foodstuffs and small articles. Further than appropriating what they needed, no complaint is made. At the college, he is under no restraints more than a watchfulness of those in charge, is well treated and properly fed and clothed. In fact, he is cared for in the best manner possible and treated with every kindness. He does not attempt to get away, but on the other hand, evidences a desire to remain with his new acquaintances rather than expose himself to those unknown. From the best I could learn, the little group consisted of 4 adults and maybe 1 child. They made their haunts in some canyons of Feather River or its tributaries, so inaccessible that they were never penetrated by man or domestic animals. The cattle of the ranges could not get into these places, and it was only 2 or 3 years ago that a party of surveyors routed them out in course of their work. At that time, the surveyors secured many of their camp belongings and brought them back, and such are now in the possession of the college. Some of these were shown him, and he is said to have recognized them. After being disturbed by the surveyors, it seems the band attempted to find some other hiding place. I am quite of the opinion that he had become quite discouraged in trying to live alone and subsist on what he could find, and had concluded to leave the old haunts and go elsewhere. Having no knowledge of the outer world or where to go, he finally ventured out in sight of whites, and when found, made no resistance to capture. His only expressed desire is for some acorn bread, to which he is accustomed, though he eats the food given him with relish. He seems never to have used guns or other instruments of the chase made by whites, but showed how he killed the deer with the bow and arrow, imitating the bleat of the young to draw near to him the old. He was quite expert in imitating the calls of wild animals, showing he had preserved the wiles of the savage to allure the wild game near him. Mr. Waterman explains that he is doubtless a member of what he calls the southern branch of the Yana band, and the remnant of a little band known to have long existed in those rocky fastnesses, and the discoveries made by the surveyors mentioned above were then thought to be such a band. The college faculty is highly elated to find this Indian, but are somewhat anxious to know what to do with him when they have kept him as long as their means will admit. He is wholly incapable of protecting himself if left to drift back to the wilds, as he would doubtless commit some act sooner or later that would bring him in conflict with the law. Neither is he a proper person to leave to the charity of the county or the local community. I suggest, therefore, that the office communicate with Mr. Waterman to know when he will expect to return him to the old locality, and that arrangement be made with Sam Batway or some other Indian of the community to look after him and provide him with food and raiment. I think Batway would do this for a few dollars a month, say about $7, and it would be the kindest arrangement that can be made. After a year or 2, he would doubtless be able to look after himself or become a member of the band and live as they do. This may be done through Superintendent Wilson or Special Agent Kelsey. If a clerk is allowed Superintendent Wilson to be stationed at Reading, it would be quite easy for him to look after the details. I assured the college faculty that I felt the office would in no way interfere so long as the Indian was properly treated and was not permitted to be used for show purposes. There is no doubt as to his proper treatment by the men now in charge of him, and they are as adverse to permitting him being used for show purposes as the government can be. So, no anxiety need be felt under present arrangements. Very respectfully, Charles L. Davis, Supervisor of Farming. Ishi had a new home for a time on Parnassus Avenue. He had arrived. Observed author Theodore Kroeber in Ishi in Two Worlds, 1961, page 120. Now he, too, was a modern man, a city dweller with a street address. Chapter 3. Call him Ishi. He is without doubt the most uncontaminated aboriginal in the known world today. Even in the interior of Africa or in Australia, it is doubtful if such a specimen of man could be found. Yet he was found near to civilization. 1911, Tuesday afternoon, September the 5th, the first full day. Through the nameless one's strange enunciations, pronouncing his words with smacking sounds, Sam Batwee heard the Indian say, Yahi. It made Batwee stand up. Yahi was the Indian's word for person or people. Batwee went to Kroeber about his find, which very much pleased the professor, for at that moment, coming up with a new name for the Indian was a growing concern. The concern soon magnified for Kroeber when even his museum people were themselves saying they must have something by which to call the Yahi, except just that. Sam Batwee's direct questioning of the unnamed resulted in learning of his complete willingness to have a name. He gave the polite fiction that he had none. He then repeated, but if anyone had a name to give him, he would gladly receive it. He, being the last man of his tribe, was what Batwee kept hearing the Indian to say. When the reporters in consensus said they wanted no more runarounds, but rather a name to use when writing their stories, they got what they asked for. Kroeber likely turned to Waterman and had one last chat. They had Ishiti for man that Waterman had elicited from him in Orville. Kroeber might have objected to Waterman's Ishi, I-C-I spelling, so they agreed on Ishi, I-S-H-I. How to pronounce Ishi was probably not brought up. Upon listening to analog recordings by Theodore Kroeber, the wife and author, Ishi was likely how the Kroebers pronounced his name, as contrasted to Ishi, which Saxon T. Pope called for. Calling him man, using his language word, was not without precedent. Pioneer ethnographer Stephen Powers of Tribes of California, 1877, had used Maida, word for man, to derive Maidu as Powers' descriptive label for the Indians living in north-central California. About Maidu, Ishi was part Maidu on his mother's side, based on Brian Pancho Beaver's The Good Yahi Oral History. Kroeber faced the people assembled and got their attention. He officially announced in so many words that Ishi, spelled I-S-H-I, is the name we will use when we write our findings. We welcome you to do the same. In the end, Waterman never revealed to any of his writings on Ishi that he had, in fact, already named the Indian Ishi, I-C-I, while he was eliciting Yana words in Oroville. Nor did Kroeber ever claim the Ishi, given name, in San Francisco was his doing. Kroeber, 1925, page 343, wrote in his renowned handbook about Ishi that he was then about 50 or 55 years of age and passed under the name of Ishi, an anglicization of his word for man. Here are the facts. Waterman printed his version for the Indian's name, Ishi, I-C-I, in Oroville, not on any letter correspondence, but wrote Ishi on his file folder tabs that he likely kept in his travel valise so as not to lose anything. The idea came to Waterman after he had solicited from the Indian captive his language word for man, which was Ishiti. Waterman's name spelling, Ishi, I-C-I, he also retained in a subsequent file he created, folder 35-4, used for part of his title that reads, Ishi Fate of Dead Yana Notebook 4, T.T. Waterman. These documents this Ishi author and researcher discovered in the Bancroft Library, UC Berkeley campus. George C. Mansfield, editor for the Oroville Daily Register, was with the unnamed and Waterman every day in Oroville in September of 1911. Mansfield, in his work, The Feather River in 49 and the 50s, published 1924, pages 18 and 36, wrote, For a want of a better name, Professor Waterman christened the Indian Ishi, which means the man. Lastly, the Oroville favorite, Florence Danforth Boyle, who later established Oroville's Pioneer Museum, now owned by the city of Oroville. Miss Danforth in 1911 witnessed Ishi and Waterman daily. She was the only one who took the two photographs of Ishi when departing Oroville at probably 2:50 p.m. September the 4th in 1911, never to return. Noteworthy is that years later, Florence Danforth Boyle wrote in the California Herald, February 1962, that the professor called the Indian Ishi, meaning man. What did Arthur Theodore Kroeber write? In Ishi in Two Worlds, she never said her husband claimed the honor of naming him Ishi. Rather, she quoted him, 1961, page 128, saying only, Very well, he shall be known as Ishi. In the next sentence, Theodora then elaborated how he regretted that he was unable to think of a more distinctive name, but it was not inappropriate meaning man in Yana, and hence not of the private or nickname category. Thus it was that the last of the Yahi was christened Ishi, and in historic fact became Ishi. Yet Mrs. Kroeber did assign a bolder name-giving claim in her biography titled Alfred Kroeber, A Personal Configuration, 1970, page 81. But she also included informative culture taboo explanations. It was during those first days Kroeber gave him the name Ishi, which means man, or one of the people in Yana, thus satisfying the popular need to call him by name and saving Ishi the embarrassment of telling of his actual private name to a stranger and having it used by other strangers, such use of a personal name being taboo to California Indians. Theodora Kroeber also described how deeply Ishi accepted his new name and adjusted to it. It was almost as if Ishi reverted back to his traditional Yahi code regarding names. She wrote, He never revealed his own private Yahi name. It was as though it had been consumed in the funeral pyre of the last of his loved ones. He accepted the new name, answering to it unreluctantly, but once it was bestowed, it took on enough of his true name's mystic identification with himself, his soul, whatever inner essence of a man it is which a name shares, that he was never again heard to pronounce it. Kroeber's superlative. Thomas Waterman stood to one side when Alfred Kroeber, his teacher and Anthropology Department chair, made the official Ishi name announcement. Then and there, Professor Kroeber defined the moment by stating what this writer christened Kroeber's superlative, reprinted from Lone Survivor of Southern Yahi's Strange Man, 1911, September 6th, San Francisco Chronicle. This is what Alfred Kroeber sincerely believed at the time in 1911. He is, without doubt, the most uncontaminated Aboriginal in the known world today. Even in the interior of Africa or in Australia, it is doubtful if such a specimen of man can be found, yet he was found near to civilization. But new old findings by Jake and Nora Turner, who had lived at remote Buck's Flat in Tehama County from 1873 to 1893 and knew the older Indians, including Ishi and Sambatwi, and who published their recent history in November 1911, have been left out of history until now. See or read Chapter 12, Santa Rosan's Ishi's Friends. The name game changers. Beware. What's in a name? Names define or manufacture reality in bigger ways than what many have believed. Beware of those who have been given the power to give out names. They are the powerful. All names, words, and symbols possess latent powers. Their projected images are called connotations that can play havoc on those who cannot say no. Ishi means man, which projects personhood, equality, and manliness. No, call him Panama Kid Weber. When the day's news was instantaneously available on the wire in Oroville, some consternation was stirred. The gist of it was that back on August 28, 1911, Under Sheriff Will H. White had already given him an alias. His name is Panama Kid Weber. Waterman, who had arrived in Oroville later in the middle of the night on September the 1st, either did not know about the alias or he simply ignored it. Panama Kid Weber? Are you kidding me? Would have been Waterman's reaction. Of course, White's job was that every new inmate's name must be written in the arrest ledger or log. See Figure 6 on the previous page. Logged in from the Butte County Sheriff's Office register, the original is on exhibit today inside the Butte County Historical Society's museum in Oroville, California. The two lawmen who brought the Indian into town in the sheriff's buggy from the slaughterhouse to the jail were Constable John Tolan and Sheriff John Brooks Weber. About 10:30 p.m., the undersheriff observed how the captive's curiosity was aroused by the writing, so White permitted him to watch the marks he made. Officer White wrote the date, August 28, 1911. This particular person getting booked, however, had no name. Only occasional grunts were heard, and sometimes hand gesturing were observed, so White took it upon himself to write Indian Wild and then alias Panama Kid Weber. The latter became his first and second given names. Regarding the name Panama Kid Weber, Under Sheriff White explained, "I christened the Aborigine in honor of his two captors, Constable Tolan, Panama Kid, and the Sheriff, Weber. Panama Kid was Constable John Tolan's nickname because he was the kid on the Butte County Committee for participating in the approaching World's Fair, the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Weber was the sheriff's last name. Surely the alias Panama Kid Weber was a step above being called Caveman. The San Francisco Bulletin with cartoon caption, "Big City Amazes Caveman." 300 new Yana words. After the Ishi naming event and Kroeber's charged speech ended, here is how Ishi provided the anthropologist with 300 new Yana Yahi words. Kroeber and Waterman led Ishi, Batwey, and reporter Mary Ash Miller and a select group of others inside the museum and upstairs to the second floor. All eyes were on Ishi as Ishi entered for his very first time the museum's Indian Tribes of California Hall. Delight showed on Ishi's face because on exhibit were mostly Maidu and Winton material belongings. They were two of the neighboring tribes. Next, upon pointing to one of the material objects on exhibit, they asked Ishi, "What is this?" Ishi gave the equivalent name in Yahi. For example, one cylindrical form of money on display was a red magnesite bead made of magnesite stone. Ishi said in Yahi, "Gidji." This was their formula that worked. For about 2 hours, Ishi was followed by Kroeber and Waterman, who took turns writing phonetically on their field flip notebooks Ishi's answers. Besides the equivalent names, Ishi frequently provided descriptive information regarding many of the artifacts as well. Keeping with Gidji, for instance, Ishi explained how his people traded for Gidji from the neighboring Yahweh. Yahweh was another Yahi word learned, the preferred word they used for the Winton. Ishi knew how, if baked in the fire for many hours, this money turned tawny or red-colored, which made it more valuable in exchange, each worth $10. One Gidji often constituted the centerpiece of a fine string of beads, also traded that way. Ishi recognized his voice on the phonograph machine. Kroeber now decided that this new list of Yahi words Ishi should record onto the new phonograph sound writing machine, also known as the Thomas Alpha Edison wax cylinder machine. Credit Sam Batwey, who eased Ishi's initial fears of it. Reporter Mary Ash Miller witnessed Ishi making progress too, as Kroeber guided Ishi and sat him down in the straight back chair in front of the machine. Miller wrote that the recording caused Ishi much amusement, and he thought at first that the records, the wax cylinders, were something to eat. It was feared that there would be difficulty in inducing him to speak into the phonograph, but as soon as he comprehended, he began his narrative in his best chest tones and told it consecutively. Ishi had no difficulty in recognizing his own voice when his enthusiastic voice was played back on the machine. Waterman was maybe the first to become weary. Ishi, in contrast, was not tired a bit. Besides writing many of the new words phonetically, Waterman had to both take out and put in every 3 minutes a new wax cylinder. Each cylinder in 1911 contained only 3 minutes of recording time. Waterman had the task of also constantly saying, "Go dutska," stop talking, and then moving and replacing cylinders. He or Batwey would then say to Ishi, "Ba mutsagu," keep on talking. Ishi shoots some fancy shots. Waterman gets credit for orchestrating the next venue for Ishi, which was a big surprise for Ishi. Ishi got to shoot the bow and arrow again, and this time shooting for show, no less, which was also a bit strange for Ishi. Waterman brought out from a special museum locker a California flatbow and arrows. He wagered that Ishi might recognize them. They resulted from Waterman's compulsive and assertive collecting forays while away on his 1909, 1910, and March of 1911 trips in Greater Tehama County in search of the elusive Deer Creek Indians. If they were items stolen or obtained through trade from Deer Creek Village, Waterman finagled them from the possessors. Aha! Ishi's face was that of shock. Ishi recognized that the bow and arrows were his, that he had made and used for hunting fresh game for his tiny band. Ishi must have thought that he would never see these things ever again. Martin C. Polk, on September 3, 1911, just 3 days prior, had brought over to Oroville the relics of their tribe found in their now deserted village above Deer Creek by his relative Thomas Polk. Martin Polk had borrowed them and showed them to Ishi in the Butte County Jail, who was overjoyed seeing them. Waterman was on Polk like a stinging bee. The Yahi Cape fur robe we now know Waterman did obtain somehow and likely brought it with him on the train to San Francisco. About the Indians' last village, it was not until May of 1914 when Kroeber, Waterman, and Saxon Pope learned from Ishi during the return home expedition that Yahi village name was Wowinupo Mu Tetna, grizzly bear's hiding place. There was also, apparently, in the same UC Museum locker space, Yahi relics borrowed or on loan from Jack and Merle Apperson collections. That included the deer head decoy, the large quiver of river otter, several brightly painted arrows, and more. This is the paper trail. The best newspaper account of Ishi's earliest archery performance is Lone Survivor of Southern Yahi Strange Man, September 6, 1911, the San Francisco Chronicle, page 1-2, and it reads, "A bow and arrow were produced from the museum yesterday, a sort believed to have been used by his tribesmen and found at a camp abandoned several years ago." Waterman led the throng outside and back of the museum. On the wire the same day from Butte County was University men give name to Butte Indian, September 6, 1911, the Chico Record, that read, "When Ishi wearied of talking, Professor Waterman offered him a bow and arrow found by some university expedition. Old man Ishi, over 60, brightened up and walked outside, where he made some fancy shots." From the San Francisco Chronicle account of that day, recalled that Ishi handled the bow and arrow with the skill of a practiced bow hunter. At a distance of 100 feet, he sent the arrow through the center of a hat one reporter placed on a post. He duplicated the feat several times, shooting the arrow through the center of a newspaper. He uses the weapon in a manner of his own, his release of the arrow being unusual and different from the release of other Indians whose customs Professor Kroeber and Waterman have ever studied. Ishi's fancy shooting with his Yahi bow and arrows had put Ishi in the limelight. The people watching gave Ishi praise. Ishi got a glimmer of his Yahi self. Shooting the bow with precision is what Yahi bow hunters do. But when the exhilarating bow and arrow session ended, Waterman took Ishi's bow back. Imagine this moment. Ishi was likely still holding his bow with his left hand. Waterman took it and left. No one takes a Yahi bow hunter's mani, bow. The bow is his most prized possession. Yet no observer reported any protest coming from Ishi at that moment. Waterman returned Ishi's archery equipment to the museum's special locker for safekeeping. It appears from this that there was already a bond of trust that had been established between them. This was all part of Ishi and Batwee's bedazzled first full day. As for owning and keeping his own bow in Ishi's second world, this would have to wait for another day. If truth be told, Ishi never wearied. It was more likely at this point that Waterman was the one who grew tired. He was on task translating and writing down some 300 new Yana Yahi words. He also monitored the Edison wax cylinder phonograph recording machine as Ishi repeated his Yahi words. Ishi's first dinner. Another first for Ishi on September 6 was sitting at dinner with the Watermans inside their rental flat at 1156 Stanyon Avenue.
See Figure 13A and 13B, only 2 blocks east of the museum. Thomas had made the arrangements. Wife Grace Waterman was the hostess who had the dinner prepared. Grace and Tom had met when both were undergraduates on the University of California, Berkeley campus. They married in December 31st, 1910. There is no mention of Batwee nor the Krobers attending. The Watermans' 2 children were not born yet, so only 3 apparently broke bread together that evening. About Ishi at dinner, Grace recalled that he fit in. He was a gentleman. Her opinion was recalled by Waterman's only daughter, Miss Helen M. Waterman, born in 1913, and shared with Ishi author in 1999. Thomas Waterman, 1918, page 67, recalled about Ishi at their dinner. He waited patiently until someone let him know, by setting the example, whether a particular dish was to be consumed with the aid of a spoon, a knife, some other kind of contrivance, or with the fingers. Then he did calmly likewise. His actions were always in perfectly good taste. Even during his first days in civilization, he could be taken comfortably into any company. Theodora Krober confirmed that this is what happened on the day after his arrival. It was truly Ishi's first dinner at a white man's table in a white man's home. Theodora added, even during his first days in civilization, he could be taken comfortably into any company. Before them, Ishi demonstrated the traditional California Indian custom when he so closely watched Waterman's wife, imitating her in her choice of utensils, in her use of la serviette, the cloth napkins, and in the amount of food she put on her plate. His exactly similar motions appeared to be simultaneous with hers. Batwee was probably hard asleep inside Ishi's room when Waterman, later that evening, escorted his barefooted friend back to his wowee for the night. Ishi enjoyed the funny newspaper cartoons of himself. Ishi recognized the newspaper comics of himself that appeared in several San Francisco newspapers. Ishi enjoyed funny pictures and had no difficulty in getting their point, wrote Theodore Krober. Big City Amazes Caveman in the San Francisco Bulletin, September 5th, 1911. Another full-page cartoon titled Aborigine, an Uncontaminated Man, says scientist, Indian lives 50 years ignorant of world's wilds. The San Francisco Examiner. Chapter 4. The Second Full Day. Ishi was jarred completely out of his equanimity by a window shade. On the morning of his second day at the museum, I found him trying to raise the shade to let the sunlight in. Thomas T. Waterman, 1918. 1911, Wednesday, September the 6th, the second full day. Several thoughts came to Waterman as he made the morning coffee, for lots of new knowledge about the Indian continued to unfold, such as Ishi was now his official given name. Waterman's confidence in himself had increased daily since they had first met just 5 days ago. Waterman had opened communication with Ishi on September 1st, 1911, by using Northern Yana words. The people of Oroville liked Waterman's manner. They asked him important questions of the day. Waterman was impressed by Butte County Sheriff John Brooks Weber's moral compass on several fronts. His prisoner had been treated fairly from day one. The mysterious man had been put in the upstairs solitary cell for his welfare because he was an Indian. Never mind that it was the cell with padded walls normally reserved for the mentally insane. Putting him in the men's drunk tank could have ended badly. Weber held a tight rein over the deputies. He wanted to determine first off
whether the native prisoner had perhaps brought with him other wild members of his band who might be hiding nearby in the foothills. Weber instructed his Undersheriff Will White and Deputy Sheriff Bill McKee to take their captive back out to the Charles Ward slaughterhouse discovery site that next morning and test if he wanted to run away by their backing away. They conducted their ruse of leaving, but he did not want to run. Moreover, instead of fleeing, he told White and McGee by signs his story of his wanderings, that he had been one of 4 members of his band, but that now he was the very last. Hearing all of this, the sheriff announced to all that their captive was now to be kept under protective custody, which lasted in Oroville for 8 days and 7 nights. Sheriff Weber was now concerned that he might be stolen and put on exhibit in someone's traveling carnival, and at the same time, Weber did not want any of his prisoners being on the public dole for any great length of time. Since he was an Indian, he was a ward of the U.S. government. They were the ones, by law, who had the final say regarding his fate. Waterman had successfully worked with Kroeber to convince both the special agent Charles E. Kelsey with the Bureau of Indian Affairs office in San Jose and Butte County Sheriff Weber to agree to the professor's plan to take charge temporarily of the subject, based largely on their talents as scholars in Indian languages with the University of California. They promised to maintain watchfulness, good treatment, proper food, and clothes for the time traveler. Waterman may have shared with Kroeber what Indian Affairs agent from Washington Charles L. Davis had emphasized as priority. It is not permitted that he be used for show purposes. Tom kissed Grace goodbye. Gleefully, he dashed down their front stoop steps on Stanton Street. Briskly, he walked the 1 block south to Parnassus, and at the corner he turned right. He continued west 2 blocks, the farthest of the 3 large affiliated colleges in front, and on his left was the museum. Waterman knew Kroeber would also want him to use the museum's account to purchase as many newspapers with yesterday's news. 2 new words that would appear for the very first time in print were Yahi and Ishi. All this data must be saved with the dates and page numbers noted, all part of the Anthropology Department's documentation. Ishi enthralled by the workings of the common rolled-down window shade. Upon knocking on the door upstairs and entering the same corner room that Kroeber had assigned for Ishi and Batwee as their living quarters, Waterman discovered Ishi awake and standing by the window. Waterman wrote, Ishi was jarred completely out of his equanimity by a window shade. On the morning of his 2nd day at the museum, I found him trying to raise the shade to let the sunlight in. It gave me a queer feeling to realize that never in his experience, either in his Canyon home or in the Oroville jail, where he spent his first 30 hours of civilization as an honored guest, had he encountered the common roller shade. He tried to push it to one side, and it would not go. He pushed it up, and it would not stay. I showed him how to give it a little jerk and let it run up. The subsequent 5 minutes he utilized for a reflection. When I came back at the end of that time, he was still trying to figure out where the shade had gone. Reviewed from afar, Ishi's window shade intrigue has remained a continued fascination for so many in this day. 35 years later, for instance, respected San Francisco columnist Robert O'Brien of Riptides, January 21st of 1946, on page 14, would write, and a window shade was a baffling mystery to Ishi. An hour after he had been shown how with a light jerk to roll it up, he was still trying to figure out what happened to the shade and where it had gone. Waterman carried out 2 conclusive tests of his own. Thomas Waterman, who was the 5th man hired in 1907 by Chair Alfred L. Kroeber of the Anthropology Department at the University of California, Berkeley, was assigned by Kroeber for Waterman's preliminary work assignment to complete a paper that summarized the history of the small group of Deer Creek Indians who appeared and vanished in November of 1908. It was hypothesized, not proven, that the Indian, now named Ishi, was probably a Southern Yana. Just yesterday, Sam Batwey had learned from Ishi that he had called his group the Yahi, the people. But was Ishi irrefutably one of the Deer Creeks? Waterman announced to his superior that today he would have the definitive proof regarding this test question. The answer depended on what would be the Indians' reaction upon seeing, first, the deer head decoy mask taken by Merle Apperson from that last camp on Deer Creek, and secondly, the set of photographs Waterman had taken in 1909 of the 3 abandoned house structures in the deserted camp above Deer Creek, having been led to its remote location by the Appersons. Would Ishi recognize the deer head decoy mask that the Apperson family had taken from the Deer Creek encampment? The experiments took place on Wednesday, September 6th in the museum upstairs in the exhibit hall. Batwey was present. San Francisco Call reporter Mary Ash Miller was also present. Arguably, it was reporter Miller's September 7th essay that best described Ishi's response. Yesterday morning, Ishi was taken upstairs to the Museum of the Affiliated Colleges and shown specimens of the Indian tribes of California, most of them Maidu and Winton Indians of the Sacramento Valley. Then he was shown pictures of a deserted camp in the Deer Creek Canyon taken by Waterman when on visit there about a year ago. There he recognized at once, and some of the possessions brought to the museum were seized upon and claimed for his own at once. One of the interesting possessions of his camp was a deer head, dried, stuffed with grasses, and used as a decoy for hunting. Ishi was surely one of the Deer Creeks. After all, the fur cape blanket robe that had been shown to Ishi in Oroville by Martin Polk and that he had reluctantly put on in San Francisco on September 5th for the first photo session, Ishi had also clearly recognized and claimed belonged to his people. The photos of the house structures he knew of intimately. The deer head decoy mask he also recognized. All these relics, to Waterman's credit, he had apparently obtained on loan. The several other possessions reported Miller noted were brought to the museum and preserved there for the time being. Even the bow and arrows with which Ishi made some fancy shots could have come from the Polk collection. One bow and several arrows Waterman would subsequently catalog in Chico on September 13, 1914 as part of the Polk J. McCord Stilson collection. All the bows and arrows pillaged from the remote village in 1908 were probably made by and used by Ishi, as he was the main caregiver who provided the fresh game for the 3 others in hiding with Ishi, namely, 1, Ishi's aged and crippled Ghana mother, 2, the band's medicine man called Uncle, and 3, Ishi's Yella, sister cousin, whom the Spiegel white settler family called their ally, and later, in the 1930s, called her Red Wing because of the popular country song they liked on the radio that had that song title. Sonny Jim, James Rolfe Jr., paid his visit with Mr. Ishi. One very appreciative and convivial soul who visited the museum on September the 6th and who was not among the gawkers who came to see the phenomenon was James Rolfe Jr. Born August 23, 1869, Rolfe was one of San Francisco's most wealthy millionaire residents. He was co-partner with George Hind of the ship-owning and shipbuilding industry. Many Matson cruise ships that took passengers around the world had been built by Rolfe and Hind. The value of their fleet of merchant vessels ran into the staggering millions. Now, in 1911, Rolfe was a candidate running for mayor of the city-county of San Francisco. The incumbent to defeat was P.H. McCarthy. Rolfe represented the San Francisco Merchants Exchange. As a sincere and hopeful political candidate, he brought with him inside the museum political buttons. He finagled somehow for Ishi to wear 2 of his Rolfe for Mayor buttons. They were pinned onto Ishi's lapels. Rolfe was a very civic-minded businessman. When the 1906 Great Fire and Earthquake struck, James Rolfe Jr. became one of the city's most appreciated philanthropists. Rolfe never missed an opportunity to serve others. His moniker, Sunny Jim, grew from his charismatic smile, his encouragements, and publicly expressed tears of joy for the 1906 Great Earthquake and Fire survivors, who he witnessed were bettering themselves. The Rolfe's Mission Bank and Mission Relief Association aided countless 1906 earthquake refugee victims to get back onto their feet. To his many neighbors, Rolfe Jr. was their beloved. Rolfe had wealthy friends, too, who would bail him out when he later fell on hard times. Political favors were how he paid his debtors back. James Rolfe Jr. was an honest man. Rolfe proudly claims his Powhatan heritage. James Rolfe Jr. was also proud of his ancestry. Whenever he met an American Indian, he would solemnly announce that he was a descendant of Pocahontas. It may have been this communication that Rolfe Jr. began with Kroeber or Waterman, which ultimately got Ishi the pins. The 1915 pin that Ishi wears in the photos also may have come from James Rolfe Jr. Some 8 months prior, on January 31st of 1911, the U.S. Congress passed the special resolution naming San Francisco the site for the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915. Transportation to and from this international extravaganza would require steamship lines. Rolfe became one of the vice presidents of the committee of the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Rolfe's recruitment of Ishi to wear his buttons helped him become San Francisco's next mayor. Rolfe won a majority in the primary election on September 26th and took office January 8th of 1912. He would win again in 1915 while Ishi was still alive. Rolfe would also win in 1919, 1922, and 1926, and went on to become California's 27th governor, serving from 1931 to 1934. Rolfe is remembered for instituting the state sales tax, then known as pennies for Jimmy, and for establishing the state of California's park system. Rolfe Jr. also openly ignored the prohibition laws and once even sent a case of whiskey to a condemned man. He caused quite an uproar by refusing protection for 2 kidnappers, and then, when they were lynched by a mob and publicly, he proclaimed, "Justice was served." The end result of Rolfe's visit was that from that day forward, Ishi began his latest hobby. By October 16th, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that in the lapels of his coat, there were election buttons as far as the eye could see. Ishi's arrival coincided with the Progressive Party platform that called for social reforms. In the fall of 1911, there were both the California primary election on September 26th and the special election held on October 10th, 1911, which involved 23 state constitutional amendments on the ballot. Women's suffrage in California was a most significant Progressive Party issue. Several votes for women buttons ended up on Ishi's coat. Button Pins Addendum. Here is what was observed of Ishi by an unnamed journalist of the day writing for the San Francisco Chronicle. 1 month later, on Sunday, October 15th, inside the museum during open hours, 1 to 4 o'clock. In a little partition corner of California Indian Hall of the Affiliated Colleges Museum, he sat silent and patiently from 1 until 4 o'clock. At rare intervals, the Southern Yana Museum resident would look up from his public demonstrations of weaving a fishnet and scan the faces of those that peered into his own. Then he would smile or chuckle audibly and return to the weaving. Ishi was dressed in his Sunday's best. He wore a light gray coat, dark trousers, a dark soft shirt, and a flaming red tie. In the lapels of his coat, there were election buttons as far as the eye could see. These were worn with a charmingly simple indiscrimination for Rolfe and P.R. McCarthy. For Rolfe and P.R. McCarthy in the race for mayor of San Francisco, and were conspicuously close together, as were Fickert and Hawthorne, who were running for San Francisco District Attorney. Besides the Panama Pacific International Exposition button was a German silver peddler's badge, number 12. In fact, so thoroughly were his coat lapels covered that there was no room for a pink rose, so Ishi tucked the stem of this under his coat collar somewhere near the back of his neck. Ishi did not have a word to say, which is probably just as well, for he couldn't have been understood had he spoken. He just sat quietly and permitted himself to be thoroughly inspected. Military battery report from Fort Berry scared Ishi. Early in the afternoon on September 6, 1911, the whole building in which Ishi was sitting suddenly quivered. There had been a terrific report. Ishi jumped to his feet and stood for a moment with fear in every feature. "What fall down? A great stone?" he asked Sam Batwey. A 12-inch gun had been discharged over at Fort Berry, located 12.3 miles distant. The thing was not explained, and when a second report came, Ishi sat with his hands demurely clasped in his lap and said nothing. San Francisco Examiner, September 7, 1911. Ishi will be going on a motor car tour soon. Announcement. Ishi's going to be taken on a real sightseeing trip about the city in a few days when he gets more accustomed to his surroundings. The primordial man on a privately conducted rubberneck wagon, and it will be worth more than the $1 for the alleged 20-mile trip. This appeared in Ishi is Having Lots of Fun in White Man's Way, September 6, 1911, the San Francisco Bulletin. Louis J. Stellman's Photos of Ishi. San Francisco-based artist and photo essayist Louis J. Stellman took several quality photographs of Ishi during his first 4 months of living in the city. Kroeber was pleased to have Stellman on hand, especially during Ishi's first days of living in San Francisco. Published in January 1912 was Stellman's essay, Ishi the Lonely, in Sunset the Pacific Monthly, Volume 28, Number 1, which included 3 photographs. About Ishi, Stellman learned that he does not want to go to any Indian reservation. To all questions on this matter, he says, "I am happy. I want to stay here." Ishi the man was authentic. No reporter, man nor woman, ever wrote that Ishi was a fake. To the contrary, Ishi was believed to be genuine, honest, and religious by all who met him. Today, Waterman had further proof that Ishi was one of the last of the Deer Creeks. He was one of the last of the Combo band of the Nazi tribe, described in Stephen Powers' work, Tribes of California, 1877. Kroeber just yesterday had correctly declared about Ishi that he is without doubt the most uncontaminated Aboriginal in the known world today. Let us reread the content of Thomas Waterman's letter to Alfred Kroeber immediately after Waterman had completed his first session with Ishi in the jail only 5 days ago in Oroville. September 1st, 1911. Dear Professor Kroeber, this man is undoubtedly wild. He has pieces of deer thong in place of ornaments in the lobes of his ears and a wooden plug in the septum of his nose. He recognizes most of my Yana words, and a fair proportion of his own seem to be identical. Some of his, however, are either quite different or else my pronunciation of them is very bad because he doesn't respond to them except by pointing to his ears and asking to have them repeated. Cooey, no, it is not, is one. Aliyah, yes, pleases him immensely. I think I get a few endings that don't occur in Northern Yana on nouns, for example. Phonetically, he has some of the prettiest cracked consonants I have ever heard in my life. He will be a splendid informant, especially for phonetics, for he speaks very clearly. I have not communicated with him successfully enough to get his story, but what can I expect? He has a yarn to tell about his woman who had a baby on her back and seems to have been drowned, except that he is cheerful about it. We had a lot of conversations this morning about deer hunting and making acorn soup, but I got as far as my list of words would take me. If I am not mistaken, he's full of religion, bathing at sunrise, putting out pinches of tobacco where the lightning strikes, etc. About his being so cheerful, about a woman with baby who had drowned, Theodora Kroeber in Issuing Two Worlds provided a suitable explanation that Waterman misunderstood. In the excitement and relief of having someone to talk to, Ishi poured out confidences and recollections, which Waterman could by no means comprehend even with the air of an elaborate pantomime. Ishi's seeming pleasure was not in the recollected event, but was rather a near hysteria induced by human interchange of speech and feelings too long denied. But it remains a false notion to argue Ishi was alone on Deer Creek and Mill Creek canyons for long, maybe a span of a few weeks at the most. For instance, in November of 1908, when the Yahi's last village, Grizzly Bear's hiding place, was discovered and completely sacked, it was the very next day when Ishi returned and rescued his aged Ghana mother. He carried her some 3 miles upstream to safety at Ghana Baksani Upper Camp. She lingered for 3 months before she died in February 1909. When she passed, part of Ishi's great sense of loss was that now he was very certain that there was no other person in the entire world who spoke the Yahi language, which was Ishi's readiest language. The poisoning event by Ledge Graham occurred probably in the summer of 1911, not in 1894, as D.B. Lyon had told T.T. Waterman. In 1911, Ishi was forced to make his exodus with 3 others. According to Ishi's own story of his wanderings, conveyed by sign language to the 2 lawmen in Oroville in 1911, Ishi signed that at first there had been 4 in the party. For these reasons, Ishi was not alone. Maybe a schism ensued among the Mill Creeks. When too many of a traditional Cooey's patients die, the penalty is death. Strychnine, laced by Ledge Graham in the dark horse whiskey bottle, was nothing Ishi's power songs could undo. Ostracism was declared. Ishi had to leave his home to save himself. This description appears in Homer Spiegel's 1969, 13 pages, page 9. In 1911, Ishi's estimated age in San Francisco was 57. Ishi was a man with multiple skills and interests. He was a superb fisherman, trapper, and bow hunter who used two silent weapons for game, the two-pronged harpoon and recurved bows made of mountain juniper. Though up in his age, Ishi's prime health and agility made him appear much younger. He was observant as a silver-gray fox. The reality of ghosts was part of what Ishi believed. He believed that his own ancestral land along Deer and Mill Creeks was full of the spirits of the departed. Ishi was intelligent to the point of having a photographic memory. Plus, he was animated, sociable, liked to skylark sometimes, and he was full of stories of Yana and Maidu lore. Plus, he liked to tell his own stories that came to him from nature or from his dreams. Ishi also had a repertoire of both Wenihan songs called vocables, sounds in nature that have no translation, but generated good thoughts and good feelings upon the listener. Add to these the medicine power songs for healing the sick. As a practicing medicine man of the old ways, Ishi was always divining and respecting sacred power that resides in the all of nature. This was part of what Ishi pursued as an applied philosopher. A future friend with family who Ishi would first meet in San Francisco in 1912 was Saxton T. Pope, medical doctor. It was Dr. Pope who wrote, after having known Ishi for more than 4 years, that he knew nature, which is always true. This quote first appeared in Pope's Hunting with the Bow and Arrow, 1923, on page 21. I can now say with some certainty that 3 of Ishi's spirit helpers, whom Native Americans call upon in times of danger or need, were Utetni, wood duck, Buskuni, silver gray fox, and Budna, cinnamon bear, who Saxton Pope preferred to call yellow bear. Ishi had a whim to tell a special story. Outside in front of the museum at about noontime, Ishi turned to Batwi with a request. Tell one of me Ishi has story about Utetna to tell the Galtu, the people of San Francisco. Ishi added, maybe tell story tonight. Soon Waterman was back. Seeing Ishi and Batwi together, Waterman may have called out a friendly hello. Batwi told him of Ishi's new idea about storytelling before the public. Upon learning this, Waterman liked it. He knew Krober would definitely like it too. Krober had some administrative work and something doing just then. Krober would be back eventually on this same afternoon. So Waterman took the initiative and nodding to the affirmatives and saying to Ishi, Hana, yes. Ishi brightened. Ishi may have explained through Batwi to Waterman, Utetne is wood duck man. Then Ishi hesitated. Ishi said, too early, as he pointed to the tuna, the sun. Tonight. Tonight, Batwi told Waterman. Batwi explained in so many words that the nighttime was the proper time for Yana storytelling, when the spirit world is most receptive and cooperative. But hearing this now, Waterman felt threatened. He had some reporters and the eager public all around them and waiting. He also wanted to please Krober, who considered documenting culture narratives with a bilingual interpreter already present the ideal setting. So Waterman said with emphasis, Cooey, no, the wood duck story was welcomed now. With some difficulty, and for a second time, Ishi obliged Waterman. Little did anyone know, however, that Ishi's first story would be his longest. Ishi's beginning session went for 3 hours, probably from 3 to 6 o'clock. Precisely why Ishi chose to be a storyteller about Utetna, wood duck man, is no longer such a mystery. A safe wager was that Ishi had perhaps a recurring power dream. Listening to one's dreams for meanings and direction in life is a universal trait among North American indigenous cultures. Surely introducing the handsome wood duck Drake in a narrative format, no less, may have had some autobiographical elements at play here. And the fact that on this day, Ishi had already felt safe and confident enough about his storytelling skills to want to share with Kaltu, San Francisco people, who had just 2 days prior heaped glowing praise his way for shooting the bow and arrow so well. This was all remarkable and wonderful on its own face. Never interrupt the storyteller. But during the first 15 minutes of Ishi's story of Wood Duck, a breach of etiquette was committed by Thomas Waterman when the story narrative was building right after the first suitor, named Skunk Woman, announced her hope to marry the handsome Wood Duck man, but was turned away because she did not smell right. Waterman left to answer the newfangled telephone machine. Before that breach, Waterman had also walked away on 2 more occasions when Ishi was storytelling. Ishi fell silent. His arms he dropped to his sides. Batley explained to Waterman Ishi's displeasure this way. He say, better work all time. No leave, go away, stop. If they were going to work together, it should be steadily done, and not alone. The bottom line of the Yahi code that Waterman must honor is do not interrupt the storyteller. Waterman sincerely apologized, and this was fortunate for all because Ishi renewed his story narrative about Wood Duck Man that continued into the second hour. Waterman kept assessing the time factor, and when the 3rd hour of storytelling had elapsed, Waterman then stood up and showed one open hand at Ishi. Waterman said, Gaduka, stop talking, so Ishi stopped. Waterman turned and thanked everyone for their patient work together on this day, and in order to learn the rest of Ishi's story, he urged everyone present to return tomorrow morning in this same room. That was that. Ishi's 2nd full day in San Francisco ended. The September 4th, 1911 arrival of the last of his tribe in San Francisco inspired Ernest Hopkins, the poet for the San Francisco Bulletin, to use verse to help cleanse readers of some of their biases. His 5-stanza poem titled Caveman Beware. It was published September 6, 1911, and was reprinted in several Northern California newspapers. Caveman beware. Antediluvian Stone Age man, how do you fancy our ways? What do you think of our speed and land train, buildings and ships and the overland train? Child of pre-Adamite day. What of our houses and churches and clothes, cramped and unaired and confined? Corseted ladies who powder their nose, what do they seem to your mind? How do you take to our fever and heat? Trivial frenzy of crowds in the street? Your only care was to eat and to sleep, warmth and the woods and repose. Scientists say you know not of a lie. Savages tell but the truth. Really? How primitive. Nice, but oh my. Civilization will carnage you, no doubt. Collars and manners and fuss. Let us improve you and iron you out. Train you to flirt and to cuss. Come, let us aid you. But Sonny, by G, what if you've got it on us? Hey Chapter 5. Ishi's Story of Wood Duck. He was telling of a lizard and a duck who came to woo a maiden. They were rivals, and the lizard cut the duck in two, thereby winning the maiden. Then the eyebrows of the duck were placed in the water overnight. The next day, the duck, wholly recovered, flew away. 1911, September 6th and 7th, Ishi's Story of Wood Duck. The Yahi season, or moon, for wood duck mating season. We are inside the UC Museum of Anthropology on Parnassus Avenue, San Francisco. Storyteller Ishi calls in Wood Duck Man, whose Yahi name is Utetna. According to Yahi belief, the Wenote song is the love song for calling in Wood Duck Man, especially during the month of March, which is wood duck mating season. The Wenote love song is sung 5 times in the round. There is a rising and falling rhythm that is heard. Wenote, 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 Wenote. In the long ago, a traditional song catcher caught or traded for this treasured vocable, a sound in nature, because of its inherent power or medicine that emanated from supernatural wood duck man, one of the first people. Special sounds in nature called vocables have wenihan, good thoughts, good feelings. That is why they are collected and remembered. The Song of Wood Duck, when sung by Ishi in public for a second time on September the 7th of 1911, was when Thomas Waterman recorded Ishi's Wood Duck song on the Edison wax cylinder machine. 5 is the good luck or power number of both the Yana and the Mountain Maidu tribes of Northern California. Hence, when power songs are sung, their round for singing their traditional songs is usually 5 times. In a traditional Indian Nights entertainment session, one among the elders explains the importance of stories to the children. Stories are told to help make right decisions in the people's daily lives. The children's attention is achieved by inviting each and every youth to be in the story by the holy storyteller. Listen for what comes to mind for you upon hearing and seeing the story. Always Ishi stood when he sang his songs, and when he was storytelling, he had the gift of transforming or shape-shifting his voice and body language of being several different creatures in the same story. First he stands and sings the song. When storytelling, Ishi might begin while sitting in a straight-back chair. In another scene, he would be squatting on his heels. His facial expressions of surprise, hurt, or laughter were contagious. His body gestures helped tell all. He spoke as much by rolling his eyes or showing a facial expression of being perplexed. His bare toes wiggled. His hands shaped imagined things. All were devices to convey wonder to keep the all-important narrative building. Ishi knew that each and every bird and creature has its own call or voice. He performed them. His ability to imitate the sounds of nature was among his strongest talents. Preface to say, Yana interpreter Sam Batwey was present and whispered in English to call reporter Mary Ash Miller, and sometimes to Waterman, every action and verse of the Wood Duck story, which is largely why we have it today. Sam surely inspired Ishi to tell his story of Wood Duck. Wenote is the love song used by Wood Duck Man for attracting a mate. Here begins Ishi's story of Wood Duck with the song. Wenote, 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 Wenote. Utetne decided he wanted a wife. The handsome colored drake smelled the air. He sniffed some more. 3 more times he sniffed. His plumage changed with every sniff or move he made to each of the 4 directions. By watching storyteller Utetne, one could tell his feelings, also his inner thoughts, by the manner in which he agitates his dark green iridescent crest of feathers, his eyebrows. And they would be flat and smooth in one moment. Suddenly, they bristle erect. "Who is that who calls to me using my own voice?" wondered Wood Duck Man. "Wenote, wenote." Very soft and very sweet it is indeed. "Wenote, wenote." When sung the right way, it worked as a potent elixir that causes creatures to fall in love. Yes, that smell. It tells me that there is a woman who is thinking about me. Ah, she approaches. Her name is Kitipku, Skunk Woman. So now the drake, handsome wood duck man who lives in the all of nature, flew to the source. Down the dark wooded stream he glided, swooping up and then down. There, he alighted at the Wowie where his 2 sisters live. His sisters' names were Utetna and Utetni. He ruffled his brow crest up and down. That always gets their attention this way. "I have seen in the near distance female suitors coming for me. My sisters, you are to prepare food for any and all of the women who come to marry me. Put the food you prepare in a large basket and hand it to me." The 2 obeyed their only brother. They gathered basimatla, the black acorn. They pounded it. They leached it, worked it into a paste. They baked this into sana, acorn bread. Into the big baskets they placed it. They ported all this food and set every filled basket before Utetne. Utetne knew Skunk Woman had arrived. He called to his sisters, "You are both to greet the one who is arriving now." "Brother, what is our guest's name to greet?" they asked. He pretended to them that he did not know. "Well, I have no idea," he said. Then the sisters saw, coming in a hurry from the east, a little woman with stripes. They learned from her that her name was Kitipku, Skunk Woman. She was the first to arrive and wanted to marry their brother. They visited, but Wood Duck Man said, "Cooey, no." He took the basket of food and gave it to Skunk Woman. He would not marry her because she did not smell right. Storyteller Ishi, who plays Utetne, returned to the same spot where he began singing Wenote. Standing again, he sang another round 5 times. "Wenote, wenote, 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 wenote." The drake sniffed and sniffed the air again. He knew that another female consort was approaching. 3 more times he sniffed. Her name was Kakakina, Flint Woman. He called to his sisters, "You both are to greet the one who is arriving now." "And brother, who might this guest be whom we are to greet?" they asked. He pretended that he did not know who she was. "I have no idea who she is," he lied. By and by, the sisters saw a second woman approaching from the west, who oddly, as she walked, zigzagged this way and that. Was she blind? The sisters wondered. They learned that her name was Kakakina, Flint Woman. She was the second to arrive and wanted to marry their brother. They visited, but Wood Duck Man said, "Cooey!" He took another basket of food and gave it to Flint Woman. "Cooey!" he repeated to her. He dismissed her because she had no eyes. While accounts differ, the main character bachelor who lived with his two sisters upon singing and singing his power song attracted a total of either 19 or 20 creatures. In addition to skunk woman and flint woman, there were water dog, water bug, bat woman fish hawk, chipmunk, shikepoke, rainbow woman, mussel woman, abalone woman, fox woman, mountain quail, brown bear woman, dentalium woman, magnesite woman, morning star woman, blue crane woman, beaver woman, and turtle woman. But as the story has it, each time Wood Duck Man found something objectionable and so rejected them all. 3 Northern California newspapers with similar versions are provided. Mary Ash Miller, he tells them the story of Wood Duck who couldn't get a wife. 1911, September the 7th, San Francisco Call wrote, "How Wood Duck loved." All afternoon nearly was consumed with the recital of a wonderful Indian tale, which, like a Chinese tragedy, wound its way with deliberation. It was all about the wood duck, Utetne, who said he wanted to get married, but who never, so long as the tale extended yesterday, found a woman to his liking. Batwe said finally that he could not understand the conduct of the wood duck as related by Ishi. It seemed to him that the wood duck didn't want a wife at all. "I don't think he want anyone at all, but I don't blame him. All those women got to no business come there at all. Well, I take the first one come, maybe take all," said Batwe large-heartedly. The wood duck lived with his two sisters, and because he wanted a wife, he sang a song, which was warranted to make all women love him. As illustrated by Ishi yesterday, it could hardly be successful along those lines now. Wenote it ran, and that was all, over and over with rising or falling inflection, and an occasional quaver. He chanted, "Wenote, Wenote." Sam Batwe evidently takes a pride in his friend's performances, for he urged the unknown to sit up straight when he sang. Utetne was visited first by the little striped skunk woman, Ki-Tipku, who came out of the east in a hurry to marry him. He sent her away because she did not smell right. Wherein they failed. The wood duck had a way of sniffing the air after he sang, and he could by this means tell when a woman was beginning to talk or think of him and to start to come to him, even though she were 100 miles away. He would then order his sisters up, sometimes in the middle of the night, to prepare food for, to, and all the women who came to marry him. He presented a large basket of food after he had refused them. He, Utetne, was singularly correct in his treatment of those who came to marry him, and even though he had sniffed the air and knew they were going, he always sent his sisters out to greet them on their arrival and pretended he didn't know who they were. After the little striped skunk woman came the flint woman, Kakakina, who was dismissed because she had no eyes. The crane woman, Gary, who met with no favor because she spoke the language of another tribe, her talking being Winton. The water bug woman, Hopyu Muku, the turtle woman, dressed up in an elk skin, the beaver woman, the fish hawk woman, the abalone woman, the bat woman, and last of all of his list, the rain crow woman came also, and none met with anything cheering in their reception except the basket of food. When it is finally finished, the results will be announced. The next day's issue of the Call, September 8th, had the sequel. Aborigine has 19 forest maids apply for squaw job, but bride is still mystery. 1911, September 7th, the San Francisco Examiner reads, 19 times Ishi repeated this story.
always in the same words, about 19 damsels who came to wed the singer, and each time he intoned the love song, and each time the sisters provided baskets filled plentifully with the meal for the disappointed ones. Each day Utetne killed game in the woods, and his sisters cooked it. How the Wood Duck Story Ended. Mary Ash Miller, sequel, Wood Duck Story, 1911, September 8th, the San Francisco Call. Mary Ash Miller reported that early the following morning, Ishi finished the tale. Wood Duck falls in love with a beautiful young girl, but she is won by a rival called Channa, the lizard. Kalchana cuts Wood Duck in two, but he is restored to life after someone, perhaps his sisters, puts his eyebrows in a basket of water. However, Lizard has meanwhile married the young girl, and so Wood Duck is left alone. Similar sequel conclusion reached in Butte County, Wild Man Talks for Phonograph, September 8, 1911, The Sacramento Bee, page 8. He was telling of a lizard and a duck who came to woo a maiden. They were rivals, and the lizard cut the duck in two, thereby winning the maiden. Then the eyebrows of the duck were placed in the water overnight. The next day, the duck, wholly recovered, flew away. Alfred Kroeber's request was carried out in marathon fashion by all. On September 7, 1911, Alfred Kroeber returned, and as Waterman predicted, Kroeber was very delighted that their informant volunteered to begin storytelling. Kroeber seized the moment. Kroeber asked Waterman to sound record Ishi's Wood Duck Man story in its entirety and to have Batwee's help in its translation. What? One could think by then that Waterman and Ishi would have both had enough of the Wood Duck Man story, but to the contrary, all three of them maintained their willingness to get it done. Ishi's enthusiasm was apparently contagious. Respect and camaraderie for Kroeber as chief was at a high point, and work was work. According to Kroeber's mentor and father of modern anthropology, Franz Boas in New York, anthropologists' vital service for all of humankind is to salvage the stories from all virgin cultures, now doomed, now vanishing, now fleeting. To the field, then, with notebook and pencil, record, record, record. Rescue from historylessness all languages still living, all cultures. Theodora Kroeber, 1970, page 51. It had to be late when the work was done. It took a total of 51 cylinders to do it, lasting 2¼ hours. That's 134 minutes, 55 seconds, explained Ira Jackness, research archivist with the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum in Berkeley. Moreover, Waterman, that same month in 1911, wrote in one of his notebooks a near-complete English translation of the Wood Duck story, but never published it himself. Then, in about 1959, Theodora Kroeber retrieved and studied Waterman's notebook that was preserved in the Bancroft Library. She published her Wood Duck summary of it, consisting of only 5 paragraphs in her well-received work, Ishi in Two Worlds, 1961, pages 200 to 201. Thus, Miss Kroeber's stellar deed kept Ishi's story of Wood Duck in the public memory. This chapter's Wood Duck story was written 106 years since Ishi's death in 1916. Ishi's Wood Duck story appears to have been partly an autobiographical allegory. The colorful drake was handsome. Ishi was handsome. His sisters' names were Utut-na and Utut-ni. Ishi's 2 sisters in real life were likely Yensolsti and sister cousin Redwing. Mountain Maidu elder Marie Potts revealed her tribe's secret in 1971 that Ishi had 2 sisters. She wrote,
Ishi was our next door neighbor, and one of Ishi's sisters was married into our tribe. Potts Papers in Francis Rydell Collection.
Oh, oh, oh.